Welcome, everyone. Those of you in person and those of you joining us virtually. I'm Gary Seymour, director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies here at Brandeis. Today, we're going to be discussing what has been a truly horrific year in the Middle East. Started with the October 7 Hamas attack on Israel, followed quickly by the Israeli counteroffensive in Gaza. And of course, that war continues with little prospect in the near term for a ceasefire or a release of the remaining Israeli hostages. In the meantime, a second war between Israel and Hezbollah, which began when Hezbollah attacked northern towns in Israel soon after October 7, has now exploded into a much larger war with Israeli forces invading southern Lebanon and bombing targets throughout Lebanon, including Beirut, and Hezbollah firing missiles into Israeli cities. And then to top it off, there's a third war, the direct conflict between Israel and Iran, which for the first time traded fire in April. And we're now waiting to see what kind of retaliation Israel takes against Iran for its October 1st ballistic missile attack on Israel. So we have three wars going on in the region: Israel and Hamas, Israel and Hezbollah, and Israel and Iran. And I haven't even counted increasing violence on the West Bank and the involvement of the Houthis in Yemen. So to analyze this grim situation and look at the implications and hopefully point us in the direction of possible ways to restore peace and stability, we're very fortunate to have on our panel the founders of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, Shai Feldman, Abdel Monem Said Aly, and Dr. Khalil Shikaki. Together, they've really formed quite a team. They have co-taught for many years a course here at Brandeis on the conflict in the region, and they produced a unique textbook called Arabs and Israelis, Conflict and Peacemaking in the Middle East, which looks at the conflict from the perspective of Israel, the broader Arab world, and Palestine. And we're going to be giving away 10 copies of this book, signed, at the end of the program for the students who picked the winning lottery tickets. So we're going to have a discussion among ourselves for about an hour, and then I'll leave a half hour for questions from the audience. I also want to thank people in the virtual audience who've sent in their questions, and I'll use those as part of our discussion. So, Shai, let's start with you. It's been a year now since October 7, and as I've talked about, 3 different wars have emerged as a consequence of October 7. Can you give us a net assessment of what has been the consequence and the implication of those conflicts?
So I'll take what you said, but I'll turn it into the language of net assessment and say, if I organize what you said to some 6 points, here's what they are. First of all, it's October 7 itself. We all know more or less what the dimensions of the horror have been. We tend to a little bit forget with the time that there were also on that day about 343 people abducted. Men, women, children, elderly, soldiers, civilians, and so on, in addition to the 1,200 butchered and the many wounded and so on. I would say that you could put this as a success Hamas, and probably a bigger success than they counted to. And it was, in some ways, they were so successful that they almost wrote their own demise, because that kind of success had to bring about the Israeli reaction. So that's number one. Number two is, where did Israel fail during this year? And I think that they failed, if you judge Israel's performance based on the objectives that the Israeli cabinet defined very quickly after October 7, which was one, to destroy Hamas's fighting capacity and to destroy Hamas's governing capacity. And of course, a few days later, they also added, freeing the hostages as a third objective. Well, as far as these objectives are concerned, Israel failed on all three counts. Hamas is not destroyed as a fighting, in terms of as a fighting group. Hamas is still probably the only significant party on the ground with governing capacity, and the hostages, except for some that were freed as late as early as November of last year, have not been released. So that's number two. Number three, did Israel succeed? Israel succeeded in essentially demolishing Hamas as a military force. October 7 was a military operation. It resulted from Hamas transforming itself in recent years from an insurgency to a military group that knows what platoons are like, what brigades are like, what battalions are like, and so on. They breached the fence surrounding Gaza in 107 locations simultaneously, or nearly simultaneously, which means the capacity to really operate in a very well-coordinated way. This capacity is gone. The Hamas cannot and will not, as long as it's reduced to its present dimensions, we cannot do a repeat performance of October 7. It just doesn't have that capacity. So that's number three. Number four, this is a success story of Iran. Iran has attempted over the years, probably the credit is due largely to Qasem Soleimani, to build essentially a ring of fire around Israel, a set of proxies around Israel. And in fact, it showed its capacity. And that's a success for Iran. For Sinwar, the head of Hamas, it's a success story in terms of his ability to activate the Axis. The Axis was there. It was put together. It was dormant. It needed a spark. It needed a match. And Sinwar essentially had the match. So that's number four. Number five is the fact that in opposing the so-called axis of evil, we call it, right? The axis of evil, the axis of resistance in their language, the U.S. has facilitated the creation of a counter-axis. And that counter-axis, again, was activated. It went into operation twice. Once against the Iranian-facilitated, call it this way, attack in April, and the second time just a few weeks ago. This, you could say, it's largely the credit here. The Biden administration deserves the credit. Israel clearly, in this net assessment, gained from the fact. The fact is, two very, very massive attacks that caused almost no impact because they were interdicted, intercepted, destroyed. Some people got injured by shrapnels and so on and so forth, but the combined effect. But we have to remember strategically what this means. It's the first time that Iran attacked Israel directly, and massively so. However, I would say also here, So first of all, this is Iran's doing, but at the same time, it's the Biden administration's doing to put together this counter-axis and to essentially limit its effects. I think the most interesting member, to my mind, of this counter-axis is actually Jordan, because Jordan, for understandable reasons, was very, very, very critical of Israel, beginning pretty soon after this year started, primarily because the Jordanians are very sensitive to everything that goes on in Jerusalem. And things continue to go on in Jerusalem. They didn't start in October 7. They started, let's say, were exacerbated in the last few years with certain members of the Israeli government that had their ambition to change the status quo in the Holy Basin, Temple Mount, Haram el-Sharif, depending on how you want to call it. And so the Jordanians were very adamant that they were very concerned about Israeli policy, and the foreign minister was particularly crisp in his criticism of Israel. But the fact of the matter is that most of what was sent by Iran to Israel was intercepted above Jordanian airspace. So Jordan actually took a very, very active role, even insofar as, again, that's not something that's in the media, permitting the Israeli Air Force to operate over Jordanian airspace. So this counter axis showed itself. And finally, I think that there is also, I mentioned Hamas and I mentioned Israel and so on. There is a Palestinian gain, which is not Hamas gain, it's a Palestinian gain. To some extent, if you go back a few years, I don't think that Hamas itself would have listed this as a gain. The gain that I'm talking about is that what I think has really transpired during this year that we've seen is the notion that there cannot be a serious attempt to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict without addressing the Palestinian issue. That, I think, there was an illusion. The illusion surrounded the Abraham Accords, that somehow a regional peace, a peace between states, can essentially can overcome, let's say, allow people, or Israelis especially, and Americans to some extent, to forget about the Palestinian issue. I think if the Palestinians gained, it's the point that everybody, I think, in the Middle East now accepts. There is no solution without addressing the Palestinian issue. So in this net assessment, there are pluses and minuses for Israel, pluses and minuses for Hamas, but also, I think, a big gain for the Palestinians. Again, I'm not so sure that Hamas, it's not as if one of Hamas's flags was energizing the peace process of everything. So this is really a Palestinian gain and not a Hamas gain.
Thanks, Shai. So, Abdel Monem, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the counter to the axis of resistance. So these are countries like Egypt, Jordan, UAE, Saudi, Bahrain, most of which have normalized relations with Israel. Of course, Saudi Arabia is the big holdout, and the Biden administration was hoping to achieve that. It now looks less likely. But tell us your assessment, A, of the prospects for expanding the Abraham Accords, and B, to what extent are these countries, this counter-axis, to what extent are they capable of working with the U.S. and the international community to bring an end to these conflicts and try to promote a pathway toward a political settlement?
Well, that's not too easy to answer, but my starting point is the Arab Spring. A little bit, I am not going before that, because I think the Arab Spring really made an earthquake in the region. And part of the earthquake was what was the results of it. There was 3 results. One is the youth who want to change the regimes. and who went to the streets to do this, but they don't know what to do after that, after they removed the old regimes. The second was the emergence on the power of the Muslim Brothers and the religious trend in the region, particularly starting from Egypt, that they came actually to power. They were elected to the presidency. And all of a sudden, people started to discover, that they don't have to do anything after that. Second, that they want to have a different kind of a state, particularly, I will say, in our case, in Egypt. We have a project for that, how to make religion as a basic domain of how to run the country. The third one was what I call it the reformist group, which were there during the time of the Mubarak regime and the 1952 regime, that it is too late for Arab countries, and particularly in our case, Egypt, really to get part of how the world is racing towards a lot of progress. The model in Asia really was inspiring about how countries that they were in wars, colonized, get almost the same experience that we got. They are progressing and competing with giants in the world in terms of technology, trade, economics, and so forth. That trend was how we moved to that. The first trend produced not only the Palestinian issue, we started to have a Syrian issue, a Lebanese issue, an Iraqi issue, a Sudanese issue, sometimes in numbers. In our generation, the word refugees means the Palestinian refugees. Now we have 3 million refugees in Egypt from Syria, 5 from Sudan, million for Yemen, and equal million from Libya. That's in addition to other people. But we are talking about 15 million refugees coming because of different types of crises. Countries exploded in many ways and imploded sometimes, like in Syria. So that reform became a trend there. That when you look, sometimes I feel when I go to the airport in Cairo, on a highway, and I get into a highway in Riyadh, it is almost like an extension of the one in Cairo. I mean, there is a model that works on the idea of identity, working on renewal of religious thought, working on the penetration of the region of the country. So that's what they call it reform group in the region, which their national, the regional milieu to work is to have stability. You can't have a building in your country while all the surrounding countries are in fire and instability. And sometimes our idea of resistance means a strategy to do this. Strategy sometimes like the Algerian Front for Liberation of Algiers from the colonial French. You have a strategy that included politics, diplomacy, talking to the French, what to do with the settlements, I mean, a lot of things. Therefore, that camp did not see what Hamas did as an act of resistance. Not all of it, the leadership at least, the elites. That it is not act of resistance, it is an act of trying to hurt the Israelis, to do the hurt. And why they are doing the hurt, that's something we can say because 7th of October is not the beginning of history for the Palestinians. So that's a reflection of trying to hurt the others. That's it. Because my question always, okay, that's not okay. There's a lot of horror on October 7th, but then what's happened on October 8th? I didn't see plan. I didn't see any strategy to deal with the situation. It's just how to inflict more hurt. So, of course, they didn't have any accountability related to the balance of power between them and Israel. Therefore, I will say that we don't look at it as resistance. Resistance is to convince the Israelis to do the things they are not doing, to come into terms with the Palestinian issue. And that's what I would call it the Sadat way. That's the way I and my generation knew it. That the big talk and the big, shouting, it does not liberate countries. What liberates countries is to find a way out for both sides. We don't have, we have a Palestinian question and we have an Israeli question. Unless we go to the Israeli question and help the idea of solving both of them, the roots of that needs a lot of historians to do. So who are they that come into this one? About 9 countries. And those 9 countries are the one after immediately in October 21st, Egypt held a big conference called the Peace Conference. And during the Peace Conference, there was debate about if you say Israel has the right to defend itself, or its defense means to go to kill babies. There was a debate, they didn't make a statement. So 9 countries made a statement. These 9 countries are the 6 countries of the Gulf and Egypt and Jordan and Morocco. 6 of them has peace treaties with Israel. The 3 others want to have peace treaties with Israel. And the statement they made was actually what later on became the Biden initiative. That like in all wars and all world crises, what we have is a situation in which we have both risk to expand, regionalize, move from traditional classic weapons to nuclear weapons, or you get an opportunity that's the time really to talk. That's the time really to come into this issue and work it out. And I believe there is many ways to work it out. This consensus is really growing, I will say. Just to answer get to your question, Gary, is growing. They are meeting more. I know, that's for an information, that they are trying to find out a way that the countries that made peace with Israel are the countries that they have the solution. Not an extra dose of resistance in Hamas way or Hezbollah way. Because the realization, this kind of resistance actually broke down states. Lebanon was broken, Sudan was broken, and Syria is broken. So here, these countries started with the idea of disengaging politics and authority and power and arms, claiming that they will do that for Palestine. Well, we have our generation, 1956, 58, 60, 67, we lived through this. There is a degree, I will say, and another characteristics of maturation among these 9 countries. And at this, as we speak, I believe that there is coordination is increasing. And I think our job here is to find out what these guys can do in the coming period.
Thank you, Abdel Monem. So now I want to turn to the Palestinian dimension. The October 7 attacks really elevated the Palestinian issue to the top of the agenda in the Middle East. And a solution to that problem is seen as a key to many of the U.S. objectives and interests in the region. My question for Khalil is, how has October 7 affected the dynamics within the Palestinian population, within the leadership, and going forward, what are the prospects for the Palestinians to unify? We know there's been a lot of fragmentation, in part deliberately engineered by Israel at different times, and in part because of normal factionalism. So how has October 7 affected the domestic politics in Palestine, and what can we look forward to?
Well, thank you, Gary. It is an ongoing story, and things have changed during this last year. There is no doubt that the immediate impact has been a tremendous victory for Hamas domestically. Hamas's popularity increased considerably, both in Gaza and the West Bank. In Gaza, not that much, but just a little bit. But in the West Bank, Hamas was able to triple its popularity, which wasn't just because of what Hamas did, but also because for most Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority failed to act at this decisive moment to help protect those in Gaza, to reunify the Palestinians, talking to Hamas, try to represent the Palestinians by a single voice rather than allow Hamas to speak on the behalf of the Palestinians, to manage the humanitarian situation. The Palestinian Authority became totally absent. As a result, its popularity plummeted significantly. There is little, or if any, support for the Palestinian Authority. The demand for its removal as the authority in place increased into a majority. There was already a significant discontent with the Palestinian Authority, but demanding that it is to be dissolved is something that only emerged after that. The demand for Abbas' resignation stood at about 90%, even more so in the West Bank. So the Palestinian Authority turned out to be a highly dysfunctional authority. In the eyes of the Palestinians, something that we can do without. However, it also became very clear, particularly to Gazans, that the continuation of the war without an end in sight, and this is particularly true in the last quarter of the year, since the start of the war. Already we started to see that around midway, 6 months after the war. But the criticism of Hamas was much greater. The West Bank has joined forces in the last 3 months in being critical. There is an effort to bring Hamas to accountability that we clearly see in the Gaza Strip. The support for Hamas has declined in Gaza and in the West Bank. And that perhaps is one of those areas where, at a time when the Palestinian Authority is unable to benefit from that, is where the Palestinians as a whole seem to be lacking the ability either to speak with one voice or to articulate a vision for how to move forward. Neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority are at this point in that position. That leaves others in charge. However, the inability of the others to agree on a vision of how to move from where we are today means the status quo, the current status quo, becomes a resilient one that will not change anytime soon. There is, of course, the ceasefire negotiations that are underway. The Israelis are motivated because they want to release the hostages. And the Palestinians are motivated because they want to end the suffering. The war in Gaza has killed so far almost 42,000 people. Most of them are civilians. 60% of the homes and civil infrastructure in Gaza has been completely destroyed, and the rest partially destroyed. So there is, of course, a desire to try and put an end to that. Nonetheless, without significant regional contribution and contribution from the international community, led by the U.S., this is not likely to happen anytime soon. And the Palestinians will not be able to put their act together unless their authority in Ramallah is able to reach out to Hamas to try and put together one Palestinian government, not made up of Hamas and Fatah. That is something that the Palestinian public will not accept. Right now, both Hamas and Fatah have delegitimized themselves. What the Palestinians need right now is to have a technocratic government. One, however, that has someone other than Abbas, other than the current president, who would be able to be independent of the president, but also would be able to, well, he has to be acceptable to everybody. He cannot, one that does not have a base in the society or within the factions is not going to be able to govern unless everyone accepts him. And that is where we are stuck right now, because the kind of government I'm talking about is not one that the current ruling elite in the West Bank would be happy with. They'd rather stay with the status quo and take the risks involved, including that the West Bank will explode in their face, rather than take the approach where they can try to make something perhaps more rational out of the current situation and have one Palestinian spokesperson representing them.
Thank you, Khalil. So I'm going to ask each of you to respond very briefly to the next round of questions, and then we'll have one more afterwards where we're waiting to hear your advice and your comments on what good news there is to develop from this situation. But first, Shai, would you talk about implications for domestic Israeli politics? Khalil's talked about domestic Palestinian politics. What's happening in Israel as Netanyahu seems to be slowly recovering his popularity as these wars go on?
Yeah, I think that what the polls are telling us is that let's say that the technological, because they are primarily technological breakthroughs of the last few weeks, of being able to, identify the exact location of a Hamas leader in some guest house in Tehran, and other such feats with respect to particular locations in Beirut and in Damascus on one side, the ability to orchestrate the exploding or the explosion of more than a couple of thousand beepers semi-simultaneously. I mean, everything, the news of the last few weeks have been, I would say, created an awe of what Israel's military capabilities are. And to some extent, it reminded people in the Middle East generally of how they perceived Israel before October 7 or until October 7. October 7 was a shock for the Middle East. Aside from the shock that Israel experienced, the fact that, as I said, Hamas could do what it did, but even more so, the fact that Israel was so utterly and completely surprised. And it was surprised despite the fact that it had all the facts. It was surprised because its assessment of the meaning of these facts turned out to be completely erroneous, which to some extent was a duplication of the strategic surprise of 73. But also the slow Israeli response. The fact that Israeli communities around Gaza felt for long hours that they were abandoned, where the region expected Israel, I think, to be able to react much more efficiently. So what happened in the last few weeks kind of reminded the region, and that means that at least as far as the capabilities component of deterrence is concerned, and we all know that deterrence, or we should know at least, that deterrence has a capabilities component, but it also has to do with determination, with will to use these capabilities. What happened here in the last few weeks is a restoration of the capabilities dimension of Israeli deterrence. And, the prime minister that was blamed throughout the year for having responsibility and essentially escaping the admission of responsibility for the catastrophe of October 7, also gained a few percentage points because of the success. You can't just punish and then when there is success, say, well, it's not Netanyahu. It's, well, if everything that's happened around October 7 is to Netanyahu's negative account, then it's quite natural that he also gained a little bit. However, and Abdel Monem, I think, was quite accurate to talk about the absence of strategy in terms of Hamas. That remains the main problem in Israel, which is that even when Israel deployed what it deployed and gained and essentially did what I said, which is it destroyed Hamas as an army, as a military organization. So now we're back to Hamas as an insurgency. But that again, we were talking about an Israeli political leadership that until now has not articulated, okay, you go into Gaza in response to the horrors of October 7. You can overtake the Gaza Strip. By the way, in previous wars of 48, 56, and 67, Israel took control over the Gaza Strip within hours, mostly 3 days. But the main question that the government, and especially the prime minister, was expected to have an answer to, which, okay, what, and the military wanted to know, what do you expect? To whom? What do you want there? What's your vision for Gaza? And I came back here 2 years ago after I've spent 3 years in the community around Gaza, and for 3 years I tried to understand from the government what is the strategy? Does Israel have a vision for Gaza? And it didn't have a vision, and now we're a year into this, and it still doesn't have a vision. So the reason I say all of this is because without a change in these realms, there's a limit to how much Netanyahu will actually gain even from what happened in the last few weeks. And the results are so then the question is, what is this about? Did the Israeli population reach the conclusion that these right-wing policies didn't produce? I say no, that's not crystal clear that that's the conclusion. Because if you see actually who gains in the public opinion polls, these are right-wing leaders who have challenged Netanyahu from outside. They were in the previous government, but they comprised of smaller parties, but they were right-wing parties. So what this really means is this is not about right and left. This is really about competence and incompetence. And that's manifest, by the way, because the public opinion polls also now say, ask people to rank on their performance. Okay, and you have a situation where the former prime minister, Naftali Bennett, overtakes Netanyahu. And this tells you something about what would happen if elections were today. But it doesn't tell you what happens if somehow Netanyahu continues his miracles of survival and elections are not brought up and they will take place in 2026 when they're due to take place. What will happen by that time is very hard to, and the thing is also that, there's some constituents, again, not necessarily right, left, and so on and so forth, whose lives are affected directly by what was going on. The people who live in the communities in the south want to know that, that there's enough, let's say, security and safety to allow them to go back home. And in the last few days, the town of Sderot, which is kind of a symbol to the other smaller communities in the south, have now become, again, the target practice of rockets, even rockets launched from the northern part of the Gaza Strip, which was supposed to be the part of the Gaza Strip cleaned or cleared first. And of course, not to speak of what is going on from the north, where there's no chance, there's not a vision right now that, or a formula about how people will return to their homes. And we're talking 60,000, 70,000 people that have been evacuated from their homes or have self-evacuated from their homes already a full year, and nobody has a formula. Neither in this case, the Biden administration presented some plan, some vision for ceasefire and hostage exchange and so on for the South. For the North, so far, nobody brought us some kind of a formula. So this is where Israeli domestic politics is. It's in the realm of the unknown, because insecurity and instability because there's nothing to hang on to right now.
Thank you. So, Abdel Monem, I want to ask you about one element of a possible day after. People have talked about a multilateral Arab force that could help keep peace and provide security in Gaza. So is this a realistic prospect, and under what conditions do you think Egypt and the UAE and so forth would be willing to commit forces in Gaza when the fighting is over?
I think we are in the day after the day after. Well, yeah, I mean, the word "day after" became very famous after the clash started in the horrifying what happened in October 7th and what came after, which was much more horror. Reached actually 70% of the casualties are women or children. Wars take the worst of all people. And I don't think that the end of any war, anybody become victorious. That probably was in the very old days when people were fighting with swords. But now when the technologies of drones and rockets and missiles are out, so I will say that the day after, which now is the ceasefire business, that's the day after of tomorrow that we need. And I think the modalities after I see change on the picture that's happening. The overcoming of the Lebanese theater of operation by Israel was as much more brilliant than the one that happened on October 17th from a military point of view. I mean, to take off 3,000 people, 900 of them became blind. Because actually when, the badger is heated, people get it out and try to look why it's heated. So about 900 people lost their sight into that operation. That was the beginning of a big change. Israel became very skillful in assassination, for instance. That's to pick up leadership in such a way that paralyzed the Hezbollah and also worked inside Iran. So it's part of the fighting is that you have the other side here, the enemy, is really losing control of his own capabilities and communication within these capabilities. But the better way to do is what's after that. And so what? What's next? What's the day after will be? The classicos here, there are a settlement. Once you have a ceasefire, then you need, in terms of forces, I don't think neither Egypt or Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, any of the ninth, all will accept what kinds of roles will happen. I mean, it happened before in Lebanon. There was something called the Arab Deterrence Force, in which it was Saudi Arabia and Lamar. Once the local population started to really, for political reasons, people got out. I think in terms of Gaza, it will happen. I mean, there is no particular issue, except I think that how the Egyptian, at least, and the Emiratis and the Saudis, the one I connect to, were mind to do the reconstruction, to do the security part. However, they want an international umbrella that this time we are serious. We will take the opportunity to carry the situation to where it should be. Saudi Arabia, in their foreign minister speech in the UN General Assembly, talked about an international alliance for peace. That really the purpose is to have two-state solutions. Then, for myself, I said, we want two-state solution. We know that we want our Palestinian brothers to have a state. But what is the other state? It is Israel. So now how we are going to deal with Israel? The best thing to do is to do what Sadat did, is really want to engage Israel into the region. I don't think Jews are the inheritors of the colonial West. You know, the Jews part and parcel of a region that God blessed or cursed by a large number of prophets and messengers and sacrosanct kind of books and Bibles and all the things. So here, I think Jews is part of this. The big story in Jewish history, yes, the Holocaust is, but our getting out of Egypt. Getting out of Egypt, imagine in very, that time people are trying to go, and God Almighty got to talk with Moses and split the Red Sea, and that's a big business, a big history, not only for the Jews, for the Egyptians. So here I will say Israel got to get back to the region. All peace treaties didn't happen by the Americans. The Americans helped, facilitated, pushed sometimes here and there. But I am a follower of all what Sadat did, what happened in Camp David, all that's part of my business. And I will say it was at the end that persons from the region decided that. The Ibrahimite happened because of MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, the president of the United Arab Republic, Arab Emirates. So here, I will say it is the business of the people in the region. And that is the business of people who want to live normally in a region that can be prosperous. There is killing, by the way, with all respect to them, and we all, these people shouldn't die in vain, whether they are Palestinians or Israelis. But I will say, if we looked at what happened in Asia in the 1960s and early 70s, in the Vietnam War, Vietnam lost 3.5 million people in this war. And there was a war in Cambodia, a war in Laos, and in every country in Southeast Asia, there was an insurgency of one reason or another. Then, by the late 1970s, it was a wake-up call. We need to change course, starting from China up to Singapore. So I will get back to say that this sense, that's what I think should be promoted. But let us have a first, I think Biden project is reasonable. But we are now, lucky or unlucky that we have an American elections. Nobody is really. So our job is, and I will close here, I say, because I said it in my PhD dissertation, which was about the October 1973 war. And getting that Kissinger, after the war, was discussing with his team about the best crisis won ever. The United States won the crisis in the Middle East. And he said that. I said, and that was my last sentence, and I will say, the best run crisis ever is the one that never occurred. So now the issue is how to prevent the next war from happening by seeding things, more animosity, more regret. We got the shock of what happened in Europe during the Second World War. But we were skillful. We made it in 1 year. They took about 6 years to get the lesson. Let us not make it 6 years.
Can I add one more sentence before Khalil?
Very quickly.
I think that, first of all, I completely agree with Abdel Monem. But when we talk about where do we begin and have to deal with the immediate situation in front of us, we in addition to the problems we all are conscious about, there's also a dimension that I don't think people are paying enough attention to. It's the flip side of the success story of the last few weeks that I mentioned. The flip side is the success vis-a-vis the leadership of Hamas that largely has been decapitated, including Hania that was assassinated in Tehran. And now what we have with Hezbollah is one of the immediate problems I think we have is it's not clear who the address is. Who the address is, who's actually making decisions. in either. Look at just the speculation of the last 4 or 5 days as to whether where is Sinwar, and this idea that they lost contact with, and the Saudis everybody's pitching in on this story, and so on. But it's not clear. It's not clear whether when we see 120 rockets launched from Hezbollah to Israel yesterday, who gave the order? It's not clear. Did Nasrallah just leave orders in some safe and said, if they assassinate me, here's what you have to do, and so on? It's not clear to me what, and not having an address to begin the process.
Actually, the one who put in the pager was 50, but the pager exploded.
All right, well, I'm going to come back to ask all of you about the current project you're working on. But first, Khalil, your research center is well known for sophisticated and accurate polling of public in both Israel and Palestine. So, and I know you've recently done some polling, so tell us the headlines of what the main conclusions you've reached based on that polling.
Okay. You want the bad news or the good news?
Start with the bad news, end with the good news, and that's how we're going to end the panel, with good news.
Well, there is no doubt that this last year had been devastating to the psyche of both sides, Israeli Jews and Palestinians. The only people in our joint Israeli-Palestinian surveys who have not really been so much devastated by what happened are those Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, Israeli Arabs. Their attitudes seem to have actually managed to survive without this devastation that I'm talking about. Israeli Jews and Palestinians have essentially responded to what happened in an extremely negative way. They justify the killing. They justify what each side had done. They believe that conditions that prevailed for those who justify what Hamas did on October the 7th, it is what Israel has been doing to Gaza all these years. That Hamas, therefore, was justified in launching that attack that it did on October the 7th. You'll find 80% of the Palestinians who agree with that. You'll also find 80% of Israelis who say what Hamas did on October the 7th justifies what Israel is doing to Gaza today. This is the primary driver of a lot of other negative trends that we currently see. The belief that we, not they, we are the victims. And it's not just normal victims. We are the victims that suffer more than any other people in history have suffered. Palestinians and Israeli Jews believe that their suffering is unique. It has never happened before. And that victimhood makes them believe that everything they do is further justified. The dehumanization, the level of dehumanization that results from that. Those who have done October the 7th, those who are killing women and children by the thousands, today cannot be human beings. You want me to tell you what is the percentage of people who think that? It is essentially everybody. Almost every Israeli Jew, with very few exceptions. 10 to 15% of Israeli Jews and Palestinians do not believe that. But the overwhelming majority is willing to easily dehumanize the other side because of what the other side is doing. And of course, they believe they're right. This is their land. The other side does not have a title to the land. We have a title to the land. That, of course, is not new. But at this point, this is further justification for what they are doing. The impact of this change, transformation in the psyche of Palestinians and Israelis, we can see dramatically in terms of what they are willing to accept or not accept. Surprisingly, what the Palestinians are coming out of this with is actually more positive than negative. Israeli Jews, it is greatly negative. Israeli Jews come out and say, well, therefore, there will be no Palestinian state in the future. We are not ready to compromise. The Palestinians are actually saying the opposite. There are more Palestinians today who say, let us compromise. Let's make a deal. Let's go back to the two-state solution. This is the best way to move forward. And that, at this point, it does provide certainly an opportunity, but at the same time, it is extremely difficult unless you have both sides willing to agree to the same thing. We do find our research is not just to find out what people think and how they are influenced by events, but also we want to be able to talk to leaders and say to them, okay, so the picture is grim, but you are leaders. And if you are interested in making a change, we can help you make the change. So we do experiments. And we have done joint experiments a couple of months ago in which we've assessed the extent to which these negative dimensions of October the 7th and the war, whether these attitudes that we currently see, particularly emerging from among Israeli Jews, are reversible or not. And the findings show that they are reversible. We are able, despite everything I said about the Israeli Jewish rejection of the two-state solution, under certain conditions in which the threat perception of Israeli Jews is reduced and the Palestinian threat perception is reduced, we find that we can find a significant majority, 55 all the way up to 65% of Israeli Jews and Palestinians agreeing at the end of the experiment to a two-state solution package that is extremely painful, that we've been testing for many, many years. And we can now, even today, despite everything that happened since October the 7th, we can still find a majority on both sides that is willing to support it. But remember, we're now talking to the leaders. We're not talking to the public. If I tell that to the public will say nonsense. That is absolutely untrue. The other side want to destroy us. There will never be any kind of peace with them. But we're saying to leaders, there are certain things that you can do to help mitigate the consequences of everything that had happened, and these are the things. And so we experiment with these policy measures, what we call incentives, that we offer the two sides. We pair the incentives. We give one side things it likes. We give the other side things it likes, and we find what is the most popular, and we pair them so that negotiator can sit at the table and say, okay, I'll give you this if you give me that. And that's what we try to do, and we are finding that despite everything, the two societies are in fact willing to engage in negotiations. They are willing, given the current threats. We tell them, what do you think is going to happen tomorrow? And they say, there will be an explosion. There will be a regional war. The war will go to the West Bank. It's hell. And then we say, okay, how about this peace agreement we are offering you? Before we give them the incentives, they say no. After we give them the incentives, they agree. But if we, without giving them the incentives, this is zero incentives, we say, okay, so you expect to see regional war, you expect to see the war expanding and all of this is happening, but you reject this deal. If you have to choose between the deal that we're offering you, which is a two-state solution and regional peace, if you have to choose between this deal and the regional war that you expect, where would you go? Would you risk going into war, or would you accept what you have just rejected? You know what the surprise is? 63% of Israeli Jews, 62%, almost exactly the same, of Palestinians say the peace agreement, which we have just rejected. If the choice, the stark choice, is regional war, war in the West Bank, all of that, versus two-state solution, regional peace, both sides, by large majorities, pick regional peace.
Okay, that sets up my last question, and then I'll go to the audience. The three of you are working on a monograph, which the Crown Center hopes to publish soon, that looks at the current situation, as grim and desperate as it is, and tries to tease out some hope for making progress toward restoring peace and achieving a political settlement. Now, I don't want you to steal your own thunder, but for each of you, tell us a little bit about how you're thinking of a way to produce something positive out of all the violence that we've seen this last year. Shai, I'll start with you.
Well, I mean, to some extent, it goes back, the logic goes back to what, I mean, it's actually a combination of what Abdel Monem said and what Khalil said. Khalil basically said, think about the incentive structure. This is where you should focus on, because it's where the incentive structure can bring about the kind of change that we would like to see. And Abdel Monem was emphasizing the change in the region. And I think that, and so the question really for us is, how can, assuming, and I don't see any reason not to accept Abdel Monem's analysis of what happened in the region, then the question is, can this new region produce a different incentive structure that would actually persuade Israelis and Palestinians to go for the deal? And I share this because when I look at the history of the peace process, and here all three of us are masochists to an equal degree. It's just the difference between a Palestinian masochist and an Egyptian masochist and an Israeli masochist, which means that we've studied in great detail the history of the peacemaking efforts of the last 4 or 5 decades. And if I ask myself, so what's the reason to be more hopeful now? So one reason, of course, is to say what Abdel Monem said. Look, there are precedents. You know, we all remember the horrors of the Vietnam War, and look at Asia today. And we can say, look, there was in Europe's history, there was never an event that was as horrific historically for the history of Europe than the Second World War. And what happened after the Second World War? It's the European Union, it's NATO. It's actually, until Putin's invasion of Ukraine, 76 years of peace. So it's not unheard of that the worst actually brings about a positive change. And I say, when I look again at the history of the Arab-Israeli peace process, and I think to myself, well, you know, so many efforts have failed. You know? So why now? What's the reason to believe that now there are at least the opportunities for avoiding another failure? And I say, we look at the region, what's changed? Well, what's changed is what Abdel Monem said, which is this is a slightly different region. This is a region where you already have, based on a 40-something years of peace with Egypt and a 30-something years of peace with Jordan, we now have the Abraham Accords countries. Forget about the mistakes that were associated with the Abraham Accords. It's a different region. So we have at least the beginning, and these are not, again, putting Sudan aside, which is also part of the Abraham Accords, but no, these are real countries. And these are not countries that used to be real and evaporated. You know, when I was a soldier 50 years ago, Syria was Syria, and Iraq was Iraq, and even Libya was Libya. So forget about these countries that are no longer there. These are formidable countries. This is Egypt with 4,000 years of history, and Jordan has survived God knows how many crises and survived them, and so on, and Morocco, and so on. So these are countries that if they decide to roll up their sleeves, and again, on the background of what Khalil said, first of all, both publics are at least, they're open to hearing. Okay, so tell us what. And secondly, and I think this is where I'll use a language that Khalil often uses, and by now I can, give his talk. The issue is not just what are the drivers for peace, but also is public opinion an impediment to peace? And Khalil's findings are that the public may not necessarily push for peace. That's where the leaders have to come in. but they're not an impediment. And that's very important, that under certain circumstances, they will go along. So now, if you wanted to, you didn't want me to end on a depressing part, okay? The depressing side is that there is one thing that hasn't changed. And if it's changed, it's changed to the worst, which is the fact that we live in an era in the Middle East that, coupled with all the good news that Abdel Monem told us, there's also something very negative. And the very negative is we have a serious leadership deficit. A very serious leadership deficit. I mean, look at what Khalil said about the Palestinian side. We can only try to compete with what he said. It's a different kind of, of a mixture of things in Israel that caused Israelis to be as depressed as they are today. And once again, the issue is not right, left. It's about the issue of optimists versus pessimists. And we have to deal with, in addition to, are you a hardliner or not, and how can we change? It's actually also how to cure this pessimism, and that's where the task of leaders are, because I agree completely with, there is a reason why Abdel Monem keeps going back to Sadat, okay? Because he didn't take, I am very critical of Golda Meir because there were many discussions with Golda Meir during her prime ministership about what steps Israel has to take. And Golda Meir was known for two things. One is 3.5 packs of cigarettes a day. And secondly, discussions that go way into the night, into the early hours of the morning. And at 2:30 in the morning, when her resistance, was a little lower because it was already in the 4th pack of cigarettes, the answer, and I'm talking as I've gathered from people who were in the room, was, but the people won't accept it. But the people won't accept it. This was a discussion, a really serious discussion when Sadat offered in 1971 an interim deal that would allow Egypt to reopen the Suez Canal. The Israeli Defense Forces were to withdraw to the and so on and so forth. And Dayan was actually supportive of accepting and so on and so forth. So there was a deal, there was a discussion into the night, and finally Golda Meir said, after all of her negative reasons were rejected she said, but the people won't accept it. Well, this is very important because what Khalil said is that's not the case. The argument that people won't accept it is not the case. If leadership presents people with options, and that's where leadership comes in because there is a cost. We know what the cost is. Sadat paid the price, and Rabin paid the price. It's not accidental that right now we have this, dearth of leadership. That's the big problem we have now, in my view.
Okay, Abdel Monem?
Well, I like to correct something once for all in front of everyone, because Shai always talk about Egyptians, 4,000 years. They are 7,000 years. Each time I make the correction. Second, I think people can be bribed easily, but not nations. Bribe people by incentives. People need leadership. That is the main thing. That's, I think, particularly in critical times of history. So here, I think, even in the management, look at the 9 countries that's Egyptians now, for instance, and I think also other countries in the Arab world used to idea of demonstration. In my generation, in the 60s, anything in Palestine, we go out the street. And the next day, we do it for Algiers. Until that was over in Algiers, Palestinian question started to be, after we got to 1967, the Palestinian question became secondary. The issue is to take the newly occupied lands first. So once we have this, there was no demonstration to liberate anyone. I remember one of my friends was really feeling bad about the Vietnam War. And he got a sign and went in front of, there is no American embassy open, but there was an American library. So stood in front of the American library. He was arrested. My problem is that I have his telephone number. And I was arrested, and they found this telephone number. Anyway, that's the story. But the story I want to tell you that we have to look at the behavior. I think it was very responsible. I mean, states, there was no demonstration in any of those 9 countries, and others. Even in Libya, we didn't find anything. It's not, the United States got more demonstration for Palestine and Israel more than there in the Middle East. Also, the countries that have ambassadors or diplomatic relations, we, by the way, Egypt withdrew its ambassador in 1982 when there was a Lebanese, Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. That's one of the times. The second was because of the Taba question. There was a, difference between Egypt and Israel over 1 square kilometers, and we have to make adjudication, so Egypt got that. Those are the 2 occasions. It didn't happen this time. Nor did it the Emiratis or anyone of the countries. And actually, we are the Qataris, we were not until recently, in good way. And we cooperated to work on the mediation efforts. And mediation efforts between Palestinians and Israelis is very tough business, very tough. I mean, they can bargain, the real Middle East culture of a bazaar, not about squares of meters and stuff like this, but about, if you are going to make the ceasefire, then you have to wait until I kill equal number of people on the other side, and then we can, of course, you can make that balance that's in the battlefield. The point I want to make, from the lessons, and we have it in our discussion, by the way, we have a lot of projects from Clinton and before him, every group of people made, how to make peace in the Middle East after the Madrid conference until today, projects. That was one thing to do, is to look at the things and how to improve it, how to implement it, because all in the books are there about the 2-state solutions. But what's not in the books is how to change people, their orientation. By the way, Khalil, put always the good news first. Because here, the issue is how to make new ways of engaging, and I will say again, that engaging Israel into the region. Not to be like a Western force, so it will be an extension always of colonization. Why colonization is still remembered, and that's something related to the Crusades, related to eras of different kind of colonization, the struggle against the colonizers, who are white people, blue eyes, and coming out to do something bad for us. But the Israelis are having the same thing, a God that will put us to accountability, and there is heaven and there is hell, and we have the same construction of issues. I think we have to do. One of the things that happened from Egypt, an experiment, and it is successful. It is to create something called Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum. We discovered gas. Israel discovered a lot of gas, and Cyprus. And also there is a big storage, a field of gas in Gaza, for instance, and also the Lebanese. So what's about we make something, and then we do that, and for instance, we're exporting at a certain period to Israel. Now our electricity in Egypt is based on the Israeli gas. And I believe many of the Egyptian agriculture, because there was a cooperation between the agricultural people in Israel and Egypt, now we are exporting more grapes, more guavas, and more potatoes. A lot of production that came by that kind of experience on how to make plantation in the desert and make it in such a way to be acceptable at the EU, at the European Union. So I will say, that project can be implemented in different ways, and we are suggesting some ideas on this. In addition, to work out on the transitional period. Transitional people, the leakages, I said that Khalil is working on it.
If you said it, it's not a leak.
Okay. So it is, we are working on it. And sometimes we have difficulties between which one is really. But I think we need in both ways, as working on the path forward, had to put people into I think it will be, if we have these people who signed already peace treaties, make a gathering of a name, and then can talk to the Israelis. In this case, the negotiations will be possible. But we have also to think of ideas that both the Palestinian, by the way, Palestine and Israel both at the Eastern Mediterranean Forum, as equal partners, not as Palestine and Israel. And Israel accepted. It didn't object to that. I think that's what our work is, and I hope we could finish it on time.
Thank you, Abdel Monem. Khalil, can we go to a few questions, and you can be the first to answer? So I think we have the beginning of a joke here, right? An Israeli, an Egyptian, and a Palestinian walk into a bar. And hopefully they produce a very interesting report that we'll hear about later.
They can't have alcohol.
I know, well, that's a good thing.
That's what he believes.
Okay, so I want to ask for questions. Students first, if you'd give your name and try to make it brief because we only have a little bit of time left. Who would like to be the first to start? Yes, please, come to the microphone, please.
More nerve-wracking than I thought it would be. So my name is Akiva Weinberger. I'm a math graduate student, so not innately qualified to have opinions about any of this. But I was wondering if you had opinions on the state of Israeli media. We all know that media can affect public opinion. I've seen some criticism of Channel 14 in Israel for being very far to the right. On the other hand, 2 weeks ago, I believe, the Al Jazeera offices in Ramallah were shut down by the Israeli authorities. I was wondering if you had thoughts on perhaps blind spots in Israeli media coverage that American media coverage does not have, or the vice versa, or
Thank you.
Any other thoughts like that?
Thank you. Do you want to start, Khalil?
Sure. There's absolutely no doubt that media right now, in any conflict, media becomes extremely important. This is a conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. And Israel, when there is war and this kind of conflict, what people do normally, we've seen it in previous wars, is that they turn inward. They look for the sources that gives them some kind of comfort because they see everything bad happening and they don't want it naked just like that. So Palestinians rely on Al Jazeera actually more than in Arabic. Al Jazeera in English is different. So Palestinians rely on Al Jazeera in Arabic by 80% or more. And Israelis do not see Al Jazeera and do not see any Palestinian sources. They rely on their own. And of course, 14 is the worst. If you watch 14, you don't know that there are people next door who are being killed every day. No, it is not into English. But that's where the Israelis are. So when the Israelis are asked, do you justify what is happening in Gaza now? Well, what is happening in Gaza to them is what is in their media. They don't see Al Jazeera. They don't see what the Palestinians see. Similarly, when the Palestinians are asked, do you justify what happened on October the 7th? For you, October the 7th was about atrocities, civilians killed. But Palestinians did not see that. To them, that was a brilliant military achievement, a big surprise. Military bases attacked, an electronic fence across all of Gaza reached in a couple of hours That's brilliance, right? That's what the Palestinians say when we say, come on, haven't you seen the videos of civilians being killed? Gazans say, no, we have not. And West Bankers say, no, we have not seen that. So we say, do you believe these things happen? They say, no. That's what the media does. So that's what happens in war when you turn to the media that you trust the most, not because it is necessarily the most accurate, but because it's the most comfortable for you. You want to deny that civilians are being killed every day right now in Gaza. Palestinians want to deny that civilians were killed and targeted on October the 7th and other atrocities were committed in October. They want to deny it. And the best way to deny it is just to turn away from it, not to see it. So that's what happens with media. For the Israelis, looking at how Al Jazeera is affecting the psyche of Palestinians in the West Bank, Al Jazeera become as of a threat as Hamas is. And so the Israelis want to shut it down, and they have shut down their offices. There's no way that the Palestinians can have the same kind of impact on the Israelis. The Israelis remain today blind to what is happening in Gaza, and they are unable to see the suffering and appreciate how that kind of suffering could produce further violence in the future.
Thank you, Khalil. Yes, please.
Hi. Yeah, I'm Omer. I'm an undergraduate. I was wondering if any of you could speak to the role of Iran in the current situation and the way that it's going to continue to influence the situation moving forward.
Want to take that? Sure. And then I'll make one comment about the media. I would say, to say the least, I don't think that Iran is happy with the situation as it evolved. Because this is an aspect of which I'm not sure that it was like thought through when Qasem Soleimani created this so-called what we call now the axis of whatever, or the ring of fire. What are the different ways in which what he created can get out of control? And the reason I say this is because there's no question that among the different players, and you can call all of them proxies or whatever, Hezbollah is the most significant of them. With Hamas, by the way, there was always a problem, because Hamas are Sunni and not Shia. But the issue here is that
Much more independent from Iran than Hezbollah.
Right. The situation right now, and you look at it now, that it practically, I won't say completely lost control, or, but we have a very, very, very significant escalation here. And in this framework, Hezbollah is launching hundreds and hundreds of rockets and missiles. From the point of view of Iran, this is dangerous for two reasons. One is, on the Israeli side, there are more and more voices that say, okay, but these are just the proxies. Until we deal with Iran, we won't solve this problem. So the propensity on the Israeli side to say, okay, we've kind of looked the other way. Hezbollah, over the years, built a stockpile of 150,000 rockets and missiles and so on and so forth. Now it comes to haunt us. We have to do something much more significant than we did in the past. That's number one. Number two, if it's the case that the main Iranian interest in building the stockpile in Lebanon under Hezbollah was to present to Israel a counter-deterrent against Israeli thinking about Iran's nuclear installation, well, this stockpile is getting depleted by the day. And by the way, with almost zero, yes, there's psychological effects and so on and so forth, but no Israeli installation was significantly hurt, and the casualties are minimal. But the rockets and missiles are expanded. So So if put it this way, if I were in the defense ministry in Iran and I would see what's going on, I would say, whoa, 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 we need to rethink this. This is not really going in the really positive direction. So that's as far as my answer to your question. I wanted to add just one more sentence to the discussion about the media. It looks like, first of all, we have to say one thing. Criticism of the government and the military and so on and so forth in Israel, in the Israeli media, is significant. That's like almost an understatement. You can say, well, the really critical, let's say, part of the media, say the Haaretz, which is like the Israeli New York Times, is, if you look at the subscription and how many are, reading it online, yes, it's a small minority. It's a small minority, relatively small minority. But when I look, or for example, if you look at the distribution between channel 14, which is as was described here and so on, and 12 and 13 and so on, yes, the islands of criticism are not very, very large. But then you have to ask yourself, well, first of all, at least you have to devote 5 seconds to say, well, Israel is quite unique. I don't think there is another country in the Middle East where Israel doesn't have a single journalist in jail. Not a single one. Okay? Look at how many journalists are in jail in Turkey. Forget about other countries and so on. But the second thing is, if you look at public opinion polls and you see the discontent in the general public and why people are giving, for example, Netanyahu such bad grades for managing this crisis and so on and so forth, where did this come from? It must have come from the media. Where is the source of information upon which people are basing their criticism, their unhappiness? It comes from the media. So it means that at least in the Israeli media, there are islands of people who are providing professional, but lots of self-criticism. Okay. Fact of the matter is, if you wake, as I do, okay, wake up more or less at 6:30 in the morning in Boston, there is a journal, at least I'll mention one journalist in Haaretz, which is their defense correspondent, which is extremely, extremely critical. And why this is reflected in the fact that there are plenty of people that are unhappy in the government, in the military, in the security services. For example, very, very critical about the way the government handled the hostage negotiations. Well, guess what? They don't keep quiet. They leak. They leak the criticism. And it appears, and nobody goes to jail. So you can read, and I think people are actually impressed and change their views because of that. And this is the reason why we see the results that we see.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time and we can't get to all of your questions, but that goes to show there's a lot of interest, and I promise you we'll have another session, hopefully when your monograph comes out. So in the meantime, please join me in thanking our 3 excellent panelists.